Chapter Spooks.
G'day, and welcome to Chapter Spooks, where we talk about the books that keep your kids up at night. And today I have some good news. I don't know if everyone watches these in order. I mean, whilst I recommend that, I don't expect it. But a few episodes ago, in episode 11 of season 1, for Toilet Terror, I had a long rant about how these books just kept being abusive and cruel towards fat people. And I just wanted one of the ghostwriters for this second half of the series to do them justice, to treat them with respect, and I think we've got it. Now, I do recognize that this book is called A Terminal Case of the Uglies, and the main character being fat is part of the reason why people call him ugly. However, this book's theme is all about ugliness, but more importantly, self-hatred and the ways that beauty and perception affect culture and people around us. So it's kind of the point of the book, but most importantly, our main character, whilst he may be fat, he's resourceful, he's clever, he's heroic, he's courageous, he's kind, he's empathetic to his friends. He is a great main character. So even though, yes, the fat does tie into the fact that people call him ugly, I think that because this book is all about ugliness and the different forms that it takes, I think that this does show fat kids some respect and shows a main character who is fat and, according to himself, ugly, but also a hero. And that's the point. And if you're wondering who this ghostwriter is and why I haven't introduced him yet, it's because technically I already have. This is the second book in the series written by David Bergantino. He actually wrote Night of the Living Clay, although arguably he only wrote half that because, like I said, the second half was rewritten. But the important thing is, we know who he is, and according to his own words, this book, A Terminal Case of the Uglies, was less adulterated by the editors. So this is a lot more of his actual vision. And if that is the case, then I think this guy is a really good writer. I also really liked this story. I know I would because, as I said, I read Bone Chillers before reading them for this, and I remembered enjoying this story, which was fascinating because it's called A Terminal Case, The Uglies. I had low expectations, but I really, really enjoyed this. Like I said, it's got some themes of ugliness, but it's not just ugliness. It really does lean into this idea of not just ugliness on the outside, but on the inside, and the idea of self-hatred, how that can be even more harmful than the views of people outside. So it's really how you perceive yourself. And it also has some interesting ideas of identity and cloying towards ideas of fame and being beautiful, being not just beautiful, but recognized as beautiful by others. So it really is about that self-perception thing. It's a fascinating book. I think it was very well done. And I think we have a second thing to celebrate in this book. I think this is the first book I've read in the entire Bone Chiller series with no bad science. I mean, obviously there's a whole bit about the camera, and we'll get into that when we get to that, but that's the main conceit of the book, right? So whilst obviously the way that the quote-unquote magic camera works doesn't make any sense, that's also an allowance that you need to make for these kinds of books. You need to allow space for the fiction, because obviously if it was entirely realistic, we'd basically be writing someone's autobiography, but that's not what this is. And so 2 awards straight up. First book treats fat people with respect, and first book not to make me angry about crappy, inaccurate science. So let me show you why I like this book so much. Let's get into Bone Chillers number 14, A Terminal Case of the Uglies. First things first, we're introduced to the idea of a company called Scary Pictures. They are photographers, but apparently they're also like talent scouts, because they find people who will become models and actors, and they advertise that they're going to make kids famous. And because they're in town, everyone at Eric's school is obsessed about this, because they have a scouting sort of audition. That's what I'm looking for. They got an audition. It's going to be happening tomorrow, and basically every single kid in school is excited to try out at this audition, see if they can become famous. Well, every single kid except for Eric. See, Eric doesn't like the way he looks. Eric is walking home with his best friend Nicole, and they stop in front of a shop window type thing, and he sees his reflection, And he describes himself as having a horrendously big nose that sticks out, Dumbo-like big ears, and a stupid-looking little round head, and having a dumpy round body that's shaped like an egg. Now, obviously, because he's got a lot of self-hatred going on, I think that this is a fairly cruel and inaccurate portrayal. However, obviously, it stands out that he doesn't look the same way as a lot of the other kids, because it is a major plot point of the story that he is ugly. His friend Nicole tries to cheer him up by saying that he does have inner beauty, but of course, he responds by saying that, come on, everyone knows that inner beauty just means outer ugly. And this is exacerbated by the fact that his friend Nicole is apparently a gorgeous girl. Like, she wears jeans and close shirts all the time because she's a bit of a tomboy, but especially later on, as we'll see, she is a gorgeous little thing. When she tries to look feminine, she looks the picture of beauty. But then we also get kind of a hint that the reason why Nicole is insisting that Eric is good looking is because she wants him to audition with her, because she feels a bit guilty that she wants to audition and she doesn't want to leave him behind. And so they finish off their conversation by her saying, look, if you didn't want to audition, would you be upset if I auditioned anyway? And Eric says, of course not. No, you go, do your best. They'll love you. I wish the best for you. And I like that. It sort of does show that he is a good person. He's not holding anyone else back just because he's got a bit of self-pity going on. But when she leaves, he does dwell a little bit in that pity. This is when he actually looks at his reflection and starts mulling over how frustrating it is to look the way he does. And then he gets confronted by two bullies. Leo and Jimmy are both on the basketball team, and for some reason they delight in tormenting a kid in a grade younger than them. But they torment him, saying that, oh, maybe Scary Pictures will have you audition because they'll be looking for monsters for the next horror movie. We know how much you love horror movies, and just basically being verbally abusive. But we know this is going to become physically abusive quite soon, because not only does Eric in his internal monologue talk about how they do occasionally beat him up, but also the boys start threatening him, saying that they'll punch him in the stomach and things like that. But then they get interrupted by an ogre. Okay, not an ogre. This book does seem to have a fascination with the silly chapter scare thing. So having a lead up to oh, what's going to happen? And then the next chapter's like, oh no, he wasn't really an ogre. He's just a very odd looking guy. There's a man who comes up, and we learn that his name is Wendell. He has arms that are different sizes. One's quite large and bulky, one's really skinny. He's definitely got a hunch because he seems to lean forward with a really skinny legs on a large frame. His eyes are different sizes, and apparently his nose is so crooked that it basically touches his cheek. And whilst the book doesn't actually say this out loud, I'm pretty sure that's a sign that his nose has been badly broken in the past. But this man, Wendell, takes pity on Eric when he sees the two boys, saying, you two better get out of here. If you're going to beat someone up, you better not do it in public. And they try to say, oh no, we're not going to beat him up. But Eric is pretty clearly like, oh, well, no, they were threatening me. And so Wendell makes sure that they get the heck out of there, because otherwise he'll call their parents and get them in trouble. And then, like I say, he takes pity on Eric. He says that he works for Scary Pictures. And in fact, he says to Eric that he'd look forward to seeing him the next day in the auditions. Eric thanks him for helping him and heads home, but as he does, this is enough for him to actually start changing his mind. He thinks, you know what, maybe I should audition, especially if one of the people who works for the company is actually requesting me to give it a go. Maybe I really should give it a go. The next day, all the kids are standing in line for this audition, and this line is like going around the block. It is ridiculous, but also every single kid in line seems to have, brushed their hair, done their teeth, showered, put on their best clothes. Like, even the bullies from yesterday are wearing button-up suits and have their hair parted. Like, it is crazy that all these kids are doing everything they can to try to get picked up by this studio. Except for Eric, because he hadn't actually planned or prepared for this, so he's just sort of there in his favorite t-shirt and a set of jeans, feeling really out of place, especially when his best friend Nicole shows up. She shows up wearing a gorgeous floral dress, a bow in her hair, her blonde hair is rolling down her shoulders, and it is clear that obviously Eric thinks that she's drop dead gorgeous. He's like, wow, you look incredible. I've never seen you in a dress before. And she very matter-of-factly says, well, of course not. How could I slide into first base wearing a dress? I'd tear it. And yeah, I like Nicole's character. I like that. The two bullies then show up to both tease Nicole because they're saying, oh wow, she is a girl, because she's always dressed like a boy, and of course to pick on Eric for being fat. But they're both interrupted when a tall, slender, blonde-haired, blue-eyed man wanders over wearing a pristine suit, and he tells the boys to get to the back of the line. He introduces himself as Ignatius Malcolm Scarry, the man who owns Scary Pictures, and he goes to Eric and Nicole especially, saying that he heard about Eric from his assistant Wendell, and he asks them both to follow him to the front of the line. As they're walking up, he says that Nicole has a lot of potential and he wants to waste no time getting her picture. But when they get into the studio itself, where they're setting up the camera, there's a guy with a ponytail, the photographer. But two strange things are in there. First of all, Eric notices that instead of a modern-looking camera like he would be expecting, they have an old-fashioned wooden box camera, one of the old types with a black veil over the back to stop any light getting in, because, like I said, it's very old-fashioned. And next, Mr. Scary says to him that photography sessions are private, so they ask him to wait in the office whilst they take pictures of his friend. So he waits alone in the office, but a moment later he hears his friend Nicole scream out in pain, and so he races out of the office to see what's going on, but it's another chapter scare. Turns out that they were having her read for a Band-Aid commercial, and so she was yelling out "ow" because she was tearing off the Band-Aid. And so they basically then kicked the both of them out. But for Eric, it's because he interrupted the photography session. And for Nicole, they say it's because obviously she's an amazing actress, because if that scream in pain was enough to make Eric think that she was actually in pain, then they're going to have to put her at the top of the shortlist. As Nicole heads off, Eric turns back and says, hold on. She had an audition, but do I get to audition? But Mr. Scary says to him, in as kind of a term as he can, we're auditioning for a certain type of person at the moment, and we're not currently auditioning for your particular type. Upset, Eric races home. He doesn't know whether it's because he barged in on Nicole's audition, or he doesn't know if it's just because he's too ugly, because his particular type isn't pretty enough. But either way, he runs home upset and throws himself face down on his bed. The next day at school, it becomes pretty obvious that something is happening to the other kids, because Nicole has a rash on her neck, several other kids seem to have rashes on their faces and on their arms, and one kid who comes in has a boil in the middle of his forehead so big that it's used for a chapter scare, because Eric thinks that there's a third eye growing in the middle of his forehead. He thinks maybe there's like a flu going around or something, but when he talks to Nicole about it, she says it doesn't itch, it doesn't hurt, it just looks nasty. As he's heading home after school, he passes by that same office he passed the other day when he was heading home from school, and he recognizes that this is the Scary Pictures office. But when he looks through the glass this time, he sees Wendell inside, sitting there, and he gives him a friendly wave, sort of ushering him inside. So, not wanting to be rude, Eric heads inside and says hi to Wendell there at the desk. And Wendell offers him a job at Scary Pictures. Eric asks if that'll be okay with Mr. Scary, because he didn't seem to like him the other day, but Wendell insists, no, he's always really under pressure when it comes to auditions, and more importantly, I'm his closest assistant. If I hire you, he'll trust me. And hey, people like us have to stick together. Eric isn't really comfortable with that statement, because he thinks Wendell is kind of weird, he doesn't know what they have in common, but he says, I'll have to talk to my parents, but I don't think they'll have a problem with it, especially me getting a job. They'd love that. So yeah, I'll take the job. Wendell is excited to have him on board, so he shows him this front office area, he shows him the studio where he was the other day, where they were taking pictures, and he also shows him an office in the back. He says it's Mr. Scary's office, and he says that he should never go in there. And I like this little moment. I'm going to read an excerpt from the book. Great, then let me show you around. Wendell took the papers from Eric and set them on the reception desk. It's very simple, he said, pointing toward the back wall. That door on the right is Mr. Scary's office. The door across from that is the studio, where you've been. You may have free reign in those rooms. Okay, however, Wendell said forcefully, you are not allowed in that room. He pointed to the door to the left. What's in there? Eric asked. Wendell scolded. I can't tell you that. What I can tell you is not to go in there, or else. Or else what? Eric gulped. Or else Mr. Scary will kill you. Chapter 8. The hair on the back of Eric's neck stood on end. Wendell's expression made him look more like a monster than ever. His eyes blazed with evil glee. Then he burst out laughing. Wow, look at you. He slapped Eric on the back chummily. Did I have you going there or what? Eric, still unsure, laughed shakily. I'm only kidding, son. Wendell chuckled. Mr. Scary's an odd one, but he's not a killer. A fresh wave of laughter struck him. Look on your face. Finally, Eric was able to join in. He felt silly for taking Wendell seriously. So he wouldn't mind if I marched right in, Eric said. He reached for the doorknob. Like lightning, Wendell clamped his hand down over the doorknob. He had stopped laughing. His face was deadly serious. Now it was Eric's turn to laugh. You should see the look on your face, he said, smiling. Wendell turned red, embarrassed that he had been caught. Funny, kid. Funny. His hand relaxed and dropped from the doorknob. Actually, that's the dark room. Mr. Scary really doesn't want anyone going in there. I mean, he's not going to kill you or anything, but... That's cool, Eric told him. Well, you sure got me. Better than I got you. Wendell motioned for Eric to follow him back to the reception desk. You can start now if you want. Thanks a lot, Wendell. You're welcome, Wendell answered cheerfully. So get to work. Mush! He made a few whip-crack noises with his mouth and winked again. Eric giggled. Yes, master, he said in a dull voice, like a mad scientist's assistant in a horror movie. Okay, like I said, this book seems to really enjoy the silly chapter scares, but come on, that's brilliant. That's a double fake-out right there. How it was a scary moment, then it's like, oh no, it's just a fun moment, but then it suddenly becomes serious. And of course, this moment is an important plot point for later. But now that Eric knows his way around the office, he sets to work, so he starts organizing papers. He basically just seems to be filing stuff away to where it goes. And after a while, Mr. Wendell finishes with the camera and stuff, and he comes in and they just start sort of chatting offhandedly, talking a little bit about school. And when Eric mentions his friends, in particular Nicole, Wendell just makes an offhand comment that, well, you can't always trust them to stick around. Eric says, no, I trust her. And Wendell's a bit flustered, saying, oh, yeah, I'm sure you know her better than I do. And I really like this, because this isn't a villain moment. This is just a character moment, because Wendell genuinely believes that when you look like him, pretty people only stick around for as long as they need you. In fact, that day, after leaving, and Wendell thanking him very much for his help, Eric heads home, tells his parents all about it, and they say, oh yeah, sure, you can keep that job. That seems like a good thing to do after school. And so he decides to call up Nicole to tell her the good news. So he calls up Nicole, but she is in a state. Apparently, in the intervening time between school and now, the rash on her body has turned into scales, reptilian scales, green all over her skin. She is understandably in a state, and they're going to go to a doctor the next day to see what's going on. But she then says, oh, but look, I'm fretting all about me. What about you? You've got good news? Maybe that'll cheer me up. But, of course, because he's got a job at the very place where she no longer feels like she can get accepted, because, I mean, who would accept a girl covered in scales? He decides to not tell her. He says, you know what, it doesn't matter that much. I'll talk to you tomorrow. You just take care of yourself. See what I mean about him being a good friend? Like, that's emotional intelligence right there. The next day at school, half the school body is missing. So many kids aren't there at school, and those who are there either seem to be wearing large sweaters or really big scarves, definitely hiding parts of their body. Clearly, whatever is happening to these kids is getting worse, and in fact, we get a scene that shows this explicitly. The homeroom teacher, Miss Lemley, stood at her desk, surveying the classroom. She was one of the younger teachers, but she always wore her hair back so tightly she looked old. Right now she was frowning, which made her look even older. I hope it's not chicken pox, she muttered under her breath. Then she forced a cramped smile onto her face, which made her look older still. Class, next Thursday, she began, there'll be an all-school assembly about... Something in the back of the classroom caught Miss Lemley's attention. She stopped speaking and her jaw dropped. Her face became very pale. A popping sound was coming from the corner where Carter McDaniels was sitting. Eric, who was sitting at the front of the class, turned around quickly. He gasped. Carter's 2 front teeth were growing out of his mouth. They were almost 4 inches long. His upper and lower teeth jutted at weird angles to one another. They had turned a sickly shade of yellowish brown. A girl screamed. Carter had become a monster. Chapter 10. Carter turned away quickly, then caught sight of himself in the reflection of the window. "Oh no," he yelped. "No!" He jumped up and ran straight out of the classroom. For almost a minute, no one moved. Then Miss Lemley blinked twice as if she were waking from a dream. "Class, stay in your seats," she said in a terse voice that could barely hide her shock. Reaching for the phone on the wall behind her, she punched in a number. A moment later, she was having a frantic, hushed conversation with someone. No one in the classroom spoke, but Miss Lemley was speaking too quietly and quickly to be understood. Eric thought he heard her say the name Frankenstein. She hung up the phone and span back to face the classroom. Her cramped smile appeared once more. "Please stay seated for another minute. The principal will have an announcement." "But what about Carter?" someone asked. "Where did he go?" "Someone from the principal's office is looking after Carter," Miss Lemley assured the class. "Now, is anyone else feeling at all sick?" No one in the class said anything. A few people, some of the ones in strange clothing, began to stir. The speaker buzzed on, and 3 tones signaled an announcement from the principal's office. "Students of Rutledge Middle School, this is Principal Moe. Due to problems with the school's plumbing system, I'll be closing school for today and sending you all home." The last time the principal had closed school, the students had cheered so loudly the rest of the announcements had been drowned out. This time, no one cheered. They all listened quietly. "Calls will be going out to your parents. Those students who need to wait for a ride may wait in the gym. The rest of you, please leave the school in an orderly fashion." The principal's voice sounded shaky, but it was only a plumbing problem. Or was it? "Is something else wrong?" Eric asked. "Does this have to do with Carter?" Miss Lemley frowned again. "I don't know, Eric. Just go home, and your parents will be informed." Nothing like a little body horror to keep you on your toes. After this moment, as Eric is leaving the classroom, he overhears other kids talking about how they've seen similar things. One person says that someone came to school wearing gloves, but suddenly their hands grew and the gloves burst, and inside it looked like they had bear claws. Eric doesn't understand what's going on. Scales on your skin, enormous teeth, bear claws? His only explanation, and I'm not going to lie, this is rather clever. He considers maybe there's some sort of a gas leak that's causing hallucinations, because what they're seeing just isn't even possible. How do your teeth even grow like that? But he snapped out of these thoughts when he runs into the 2 bully characters. At first they've got their backs to him, so we know what's going to happen, because after a moment they turn to look at him, their voices sounding oddly muffled, and then he sees that Leo's eyes are on either side of his face, and Jimmy has one huge eye that's got a slit in it like a cat, and his nose has been pushed so far down low it's like at the same level as his mouth. Their faces just look like monstrous mush. And when they make it pretty clear that they hate the way that they look, but they think, hey, maybe if we beat up the ugly kid, we'll feel better, they start to go after him. But he runs away as fast as he can, straight to Scary Pictures. So he gets inside the building, he locks the door behind him because, like I said, he was being chased. But then he turns around and realizes that Wendell isn't at the desk. He can't hear anything in the store. In fact, it looks like there's nobody here. He runs over to the phone and picks it up, and it's just a dead tone on there. There's not even a dial tone, which is very strange, but he hangs up the phone. And so he looks into the other offices, and he can't see either Wendell or Mr. Scary. And so he decides to look in that back room, the one that he was told not to enter. So he goes in, calling out for Wendell, but he sees inside it's not actually a dark room. Instead, it's some sort of a weird gallery. It has photos all around the room, but when he looks around, he realizes that these are all photos of kids from his school. They're all the photos they took during the audition. In fact, he even recognizes Nicole's picture, looking very nice in her dress with a big smile. He heads over and takes the picture off the wall to get a closer look at it, but the picture frame is a lot heavier than he was expecting. It's so heavy he suddenly drops it and it falls to the ground and smashes. And he realizes that the picture frame has beeping lights on the side. But Eric barely has time to react to this. He can't clean up any of the mess because right at this moment, Wendell comes in and he is furious. Wendell accuses Eric of snooping around and breaking the rules, but Eric is frantic. He says, no, I'm so sorry. I was just looking for you guys. I ran away from the bullies. I didn't mean to come in here. And then when I saw my friend, I was just curious. I'm so sorry. I'll pay for the frame, And because he's so obviously terrified and panicking, Wendell calms down. He says, okay, fair enough. It seems like this was an honest mistake, so fair enough. And don't worry, I won't get you to replace this frame. You couldn't pay for this even with pocket money for 2 years. It's way too expensive. Look, I'll sort it out. But in future, I don't want you to be apologizing for making mistakes. I just want you to not make mistakes in the future, right? So stay out of this room and don't worry, I'll talk to Mr. Scary. I'll smooth this all over. So Wendell ushers him out of the room, but before he can even send him out, he stops and says, wait a minute, you said you were being chased by bullies? Why did you come here? Why didn't you go to school? And this is when he explains everything that's happening at school. Says, no, that they shut it down early because everyone was getting monstrous faces, and the bullies chased me because they were monstrous. And Wendell's response is that he starts chuckling, saying, oh, well, now they finally got what they deserved, right? But Eric doesn't understand at all. He says, no, it's not just the bullies. Everyone at school, like one of them had bear claws, my friend has scales, like one of them was growing teeth through their face. And all Wendell can say in response to this is, well, I guess now you see what they'll look like inside out. Eric has no idea what that means either, but before he can ask, Wendell ushers him out and says, look, I'll clean up this mess. I'll see you when your shift begins. And then Eric heads home. When he gets home, Eric calls his friend Nicole to talk to her about what's happened at school and also to see how she's doing. You'll get better, Eric insisted. This can't be permanent. The doctor doesn't know. Her voice shook. No one knows. Except me, Eric muttered under his breath. What was that? Nothing, Eric said quickly. I just feel so bad. Thanks, but like I said, you're one of the lucky ones. You should be happy. Well, I'm not. Yes, you are, Nicole said, trying to put away her sadness. Yesterday, you said you had some great news. Cheer me up by telling me what it is. I don't know, Nicole. It doesn't sound that great anymore. Now I'm really curious. Can I guess? Nah, I'll tell you, Eric said. I'm working at Scary Pictures. You're kidding me. Nicole's voice was flat. Nope, I became friends with Wendell, Scary's assistant there, and he asked me to help out in the office, he told her. So I go there after school and make photocopies and stuff like that. The line was silent for a moment. Just when Eric was about to ask if Nicole was still there, he heard her utter a short, harsh laugh. What? It's just funny, she said in a strange, tight voice. Of all the people to end up actually working for them, it would be you. Eric felt as though she had slapped him. Thanks a lot, Nicole. I mean, we all know you won't find me on the cover of a magazine. He knew he should stop himself, but he continued angrily. But you're not going to be on one anytime soon either. Nicole erupted. I knew it. You are enjoying this. I am not, he exclaimed. Oh, yes, you are, she accused him. For the first time in your life, you're not the ugliest kid in school. I can't believe you said that. That's not fair, Nicole. Yeah, well, it's not fair that I look like someone's pet iguana, she spat back. Nicole was crying now. So I guess we'll both just have to deal. Nicole, wait! But it was too late. Nicole had hung up on him. Man, see, this is what I was talking about before with the whole acceptable targets thing before. I mean, I was talking about that in an early episode. You know, I think it'd be easier if I talked about this at the end of the summary. But what matters for this story is that it seems like what Wendell said to Eric was coming true. You can never tell when they're going to ditch you. When Eric's parents get home, he explains why he came home early, but after the whole explanation, after his mother makes sure that he's not feeling sick, she says that there's no problem with him going to work. But she does fuss away with ideas of getting sort of a parent-teacher thing together, sort of talking about how they can deal with this disease. I like that they're actually making a big deal about this. They had to shut down the school, and now the community is making sure that they get together to try to make sure that no more kids get sick. It's an interesting little background detail. So Eric heads into work, but instead of Wendell, Mr. Scary is there. When he asks where he is, Mr. Scary says that Wendell said he was quote-unquote fixing something, and Eric understands what he's talking about. So he asks if he should come back later to help Wendell. But Scary says, no, you're not just his assistant. You can work here. There's things to do. In fact, I need someone to go and dust the camera room, the studio. Can you do that for me? Eric wants to make a good impression, so he heads straight in and starts cleaning up all around the studio and the camera. But when he starts dusting around the camera, Mr. Scary says, oh, but do not touch it. Right? This is a very special piece of equipment. And Eric asks, why? Isn't it just sort of an old-fashioned camera? But Mr. Scary shows him that no, it's not just any camera. Of course, I use the old camera because I find it gets the best pictures. However, this one has been adjusted with special mechanisms, so do not touch the machine. And Eric doesn't quite know what he means by calling it the machine, although he does notice that there's more knobs and dials and wires coming from this thing than any old-fashioned wooden camera would. In fact, in one moment when Eric gets closer to take a closer look at the thing, not even touching it, just a closer look, Mr. Scary freaks out, grabs him tightly by the arm and yanks him back, actually hurting him. But Mr. Scary apologizes and just says, no, it's a one-of-a-kind machine, just be careful, don't touch it, but dust everything else, please. So Eric sets to work, and Mr. Scary is working in the back room. He only pops in like once or twice to check on him, but otherwise it's a pretty uneventful work shift. When he gets home, he wants to ask his mum if she knows anything about strange old cameras, but she's so busy setting up this parent community awareness thing that when he tries to ask, she says, oh look, sorry, I was organizing with Miss Karen, I'm going to get the breadsticks for this thing, I've got to go. So she heads off and he's left alone at home, and he can't talk to anyone about this. He'd usually talk to Nicole, but she obviously doesn't want to talk to him right now. At least, that's what he thinks. But after a chapter break, after he has a bit of a sleep, he's woken early in the morning by the ringing phone, and it's Nicole. She's calling him for two reasons. First of all, she wants to apologize for the ugly fight they had the other day, and that she treated him so badly. And secondly, she wants to meet him because she, and I quote, has something to show him. And I really like, as he goes out to wait on the street corner waiting for Nicole to meet him, he's mentally preparing himself because he knows that if she shows up and she's covered in scales that he's going to like gasp or shriek, but he doesn't want her to feel bad, so he's mentally preparing himself like, okay, when I see her, I'll bite my tongue, I make sure. But then she shows up, and there's a little chapter scare where she's like, puts her hands over his eyes like, oh, guess who? But when he turns around, she looks perfectly normal. Well, perfectly except for one thing. She's wearing that same pretty dress that she was wearing, which is so unlike Nicole. She's usually in t-shirt, jeans, or ready to play baseball. So Eric is thankful, but he says, but why are you wearing that dress? And she says, oh, well, that's the other bit of the news. That's the best part. See, I got a call back from Scary Pictures, and they say they want to take my photo again. And unfortunately for both Eric and Nicole, this is when the penny drops. He realizes that she started getting better the moment her picture frame broke. And now they want to take a new picture of her, and they want to use this strange camera. Everything's starting to come together. Of course, Eric doesn't want her to go just in case, because it could be dangerous, but he doesn't know how to bring it up, and he knows how she'd react, so instead he just says, when's your appointment? She says, oh, it's tomorrow. So we think, okay, I've got some time. So he says, okay, well, maybe just call me before you go, and maybe we'll see if I'm working then. So maybe I can see you in the studio. And she seems to find that really, really sweet. So she gives him a hug and heads off home, but Eric turns around and starts running towards Scary Pictures. Because if he's right, then he needs to stop Scary, and the only other person he knows he can turn to is Wendell. So he heads to Scary Pictures. Eric turned the knob, but the door didn't open. Eric walked around the corner and up the alley to the back of the Scary Pictures offices. There was a single door that led to the studio. Carefully, he tried the knob. It turned. He heard the quiet click of the latch, and he pulled gently. The door began to swing open. Sure enough, Wendell had remembered to lock the front door, but not the back. Eric took one step in and froze. There, against the backdrop, stood Wendell. His concentration was so intense, he didn't notice Eric at the outside doorway. Pressing a button on a small black remote control, Wendell activated the camera. The camera began to hum, like no camera Eric had ever seen. The hum became a high-pitched squeal. Suddenly, a bright yellow beam lanced out of the lens. The beam struck Wendell and bathed him in a yellow glow that seemed to be absorbed by his body. Wendell smiled a crazy smile. A moment later, the features of his face seemed to run like a watercolor painting. He grew taller and thinner. Lights flickered on in Wendell's eyes, turning them from brown to bright blue. Wendell's meaty hands withered into delicate claws. Eric was paralyzed with shock and fear. Wendell had become Ignatius Malcolm Scary before his very eyes. I don't know if you saw that coming, but I personally did not see that coming. And maybe it's just because I was getting so invested in this, I was enjoying the character dynamics, I wasn't focusing on the plot points, because I thought the twist was going to be that both Wendell and Scary were both evil. I didn't realize that Wendell and Scary are the same person. But more importantly, this is when we get our big villain monologue, because Mr. Scary sees Eric in the doorway, but he calls him in. Eric says, please don't kill me. Look, just don't hurt me. But Mr. Scary says, no, I'm not going to hurt you. Look, You've seen everything, I might as well explain how this all works. He says that the camera is capable of taking very accurate images of people at their most beautiful, and then he uses the frames to take that visage and then steal the beauty from them and put it into him via the camera. But the reason he's telling him all this isn't because it's some captivating villain monologue before he kills him. No, he's telling him because he says, Eric, this could work for you too. This camera took me a lot of effort and time to make. It was very expensive, and it is a legacy that I'm willing to pass on to the right person. And you seem like the right person to me. You can make these beautiful people, these vain, worthless people, suffer the indignity that we've gone through so that we can finally be on top. As Wendell, I'm pitied and looked down upon, but as Ignatius Malcolm Scarry, people kiss my feet. These fools bend over backwards at the chance of being famous. Wouldn't you like that power? And then my favorite bit of all, because it's very on brand for these books, is that Eric says, no, I don't think I want that. And Mr. Scarry says, all right then, well, I'll let you go. But just remember this, Eric. If you tell anyone, no one is going to believe you. And yeah, I think I mentioned this in one of my other episodes, but I do like it when the story leans into that. Because yeah, of course this stuff is ridiculous. It's literally unbelievable because it's impossible. And so how could this kid possibly get any help? No one will believe that it's true. And Eric finds that out firsthand because he immediately goes running to Nicole's house. He needs to warn her. He tells her that she can't go to Scary Pictures tomorrow because if she does, then they'll take her picture and they'll use the camera and they'll use it to take away her beauty and they'll give it to the Wendell guy. But of course, Nicole isn't listening. She just hears that her friend doesn't want her to become famous, and so she starts getting cross at him. She says, I can't believe you're so jealous you're making up some ridiculous story just to stop me from having a chance at becoming famous. Don't talk to me, Eric Ross. I don't want to see you again. But then we get the final chapters of this book, and I think they're very interesting. The very final chapter has an issue we'll talk about, but I really figured, oh yeah, all they need to do is smash the pictures. Okay, fine, that's the end of the story, right? But no. Eric gets an idea. He goes to his room, and as they mentioned a few times in this story, he's a big fan of horror movies, but he starts getting all of his magazines and some of his posters, and he cuts out as many of the monsters as he can. He knows that there's dozens and dozens and dozens of photos at Scary Pictures, so he needs dozens and dozens of monster pictures. So he cuts out as many as he can, stuffs them all into his backpack, and then heads to Scary Pictures himself. Sure enough, Wendell forgot to lock the back door again, so he sneaks in the back, and he's about to put up the pictures, but he has another plan, because he wants to save Nicole. Even though they're still fighting, he wants to save her first. And the only way he can do that is with evidence. And the only evidence he has, well, he stands in front of the camera, he finds that little black remote, and he pushes the button. His whole body shakes and vibrates violently, but strangely, it doesn't hurt, and after just a moment, he finds a mirror in the office. He looks into it, and he sees that he's a really good-looking kid. In fact, not only is he good-looking, he's more good-looking than Mr. Scarry was. He looks incredible. In fact, he even thinks he looks kind of too incredible. When he looks closely, he realizes that his face looks so smooth, it's like plastic. His teeth are so white and so straight, they look like doll's teeth. He looks inhumanly good. The more he looks at himself in the mirror, the more off-putting he finds it. So he decides to just leave. He heads straight to Nicole's place because I don't quite get how this works. It seems like if you hold the button down and get more of the laser shot, maybe it lasts longer, and he assumes that this is only going to last a few hours. So he heads to Nicole's house as quickly as he can. So he runs over and he climbs in through the window, which is apparently a thing he does, but okay. But she, of course, freaks out because there's a strange boy climbing in a window. And he's insisting, like, no, it's me, it's Eric. But she doesn't believe that. She starts calling for a mum. So he's panicking and he says, remember that time how we, like, burnt the rug when we were staying at your place one time? You know, he starts telling these personal stories. And when she realizes he's telling the truth, and her mum's at the door, she says, no, don't worry, it was a nightmare. Because now she believes him. So she talks to Eric, she's asking how this stuff all works, and he says he doesn't really have time to explain, but he says that he does have a plan to stop it, and he'll be doing that tomorrow after he turns back to normal. So she thanks him for saving her. She gives him a kiss on the cheek, and then it's kind of funny. She then goes, "Ew, gross." He says, "What's wrong?" It's like kissing a beach ball, because like I said, he literally does look like a plastic doll. So she thanks him, and then he heads off back to Scary Pictures, and in every single one of the frames, he replaces it with one of the monsters from his horror movie posters and magazines. The next day, thankfully, Eric has turned back to normal, so he heads straight to Scary Pictures, running as fast as he can. And Mr. Wendell is surprised when he shows up, because it's not his shift. He's saying, "What's going on? Is there a fire? What's all the panic about?" And Eric says, "Look, I want to try it. I want to try the machine." And Wendell, of course, is absolutely overjoyed to hear this, because he really did want to have someone on his side. So he says, "Okay, well, sure, we'll give it a go. Come on." Eric does insist, "Oh no, I just want to do it once." And Wendell's like, "Oh yeah, want to be king for a day, do you?" But he's sort of smirking, so he's like, "Oh yeah, you want to try it once, do you? Okay, we'll see." So they head to the room, but as they're heading towards it, Eric says, no, could you do it first?" And Wendell's a little surprised. He says, "You've already seen me change." But Eric insists, says, I don't know, I'm nervous because it's like my first time, and I'd like to see it done." But he's obviously not a very good liar. Too honest, this kid. And so Wendell says, "What are you up to, kid? What have you done?" So Wendell grabs Eric's wrist and he pulls him in front of the camera and he says, "Why don't we see what you had in store for me?" And he's about to press the remote. But Eric yanks himself free and the remote goes tumbling to the floor. And before Wendell can run up to grab him again, suddenly Nicole bursts out from the back room, along with Jimmy and Eric, the bullies. And they don't look like monsters anymore. They look normal too. And they grab Wendell, each by holding one of his arms, and they force him to stand in front of the camera. Eric doesn't understand what's going on, but Nicole explains that she wanted to help. She didn't want him to do this on his own. It was very dangerous. And she asked the two bully boys to help her as well. So they hold him in front of the camera, and Eric picks up the remote and presses the button. When he does, the laser beam, which is a weird sickly yellow color, yellowy brown, spills into Wendell's body, and then he starts changing. At first he changes back into I Am Scary, but then he starts morphing and twisting. His arms turn to tentacles, his face starts melting, his teeth start growing even further. He starts growing teeth on his hands and feet, and then he starts warping and twisting and melting so much that he becomes a puddle of slime that melts into yellowy green ooze on the floor. When there's nothing left but slime and some empty clothes on the ground, Eric looks at the mess and says, "Now that's what I call a terminal case of the Uglies. The end." I don't know why you're all so happy. You all just murdered someone. but no, genuinely, this is such a fun story. It plays around with body horror, and it's got that really gross ending there, and also that interesting twist. Well, for me it was a twist anyway, with the whole Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde thing, how scary was Wendell. Man, that was so much fun. But more importantly, it has that theme. Oh, you know how much I love a good theme. And especially because it's not just, ugliness. Because that's not enough in and of itself. You need to explore it. And for this, it talks about ugliness, but more importantly, the idea of self-identification and self-reflection, and in some cases, self-hatred. Every time when I Am Scary talks about Wendell, he often calls him a toad or a disgusting ogre. Like, he clearly hates who he is, but he also hates all of these people that are beautiful, even though he's taking their beauty to become them. Like, he sees himself as better than them. And the biggest issue here with Eric is when he hates himself, when he feels ugly himself. And then, especially the whole thing with him and Nicole, Nicole only lashes out at him when she hates the way she looks as well. And this is what I was sort of hinting at when I was talking about the whole acceptable targets thing, is that this is a fascinating facet of human emotion and mindset, is that we are obviously capable of being kind, we're capable of being nice, but one of the issues with pitying people and looking down at them is that it takes effort to be nice, right? And so if there's ever an occasion when you are suffering and you want to lash out, it feels justified that you can drop the facade and start treating people like you really feel. This is the issue with bigotry. This is the issue with insidious hatred or dislike of a person, or in this case, insidious disgust at the way a person looks, because it means that unless you deal with that, when the chips are down, you expose your real self. You are your true self in the dark. And when she's in her darkest place, she treats her friend like crap because she thinks that he deserves it more than she does. Is that nice? No, but that is good characterization. That makes emotional sense. And like I said, I love Eric as a character. He's really well done. He really cares about what his friends think. He's always putting others before himself. And he's always trying to make sure that everyone's safe as well. That's the thing. I love the fact that he didn't have to. Technically, if he didn't tell Nicole anything and he just sorted it out, it would be safe. But he didn't know when her appointment was. He didn't know whether or not what he was doing would work. And so before anything else, he put himself at risk. He used this machine on himself. He didn't even know if it would hurt. And then he went to her, risking his own plan because he didn't know when it would wear off either. Like, to me, that shows just how much of a good, caring person Eric is. Also, he's fat. Like, you see what I'm saying? Like, this is the way you do good characterization with characters like this. And he's clever too. Like I said, I never thought about that whole monster picture thing, but it makes sense based on the way that this system works, this machine works. It takes a photo, but then the mechanics of it allow it to feed that quote-unquote beauty energy back through it. And so if you replace those photos with something nasty, yeah, it'll turn someone into something even nastier. The other thing I'm not 100% on, and I'm not a big fan of, is that the way these people turn ugly, it really does just seem to turn them into monsters. Like I said, some people have bear claws, some people are growing scales, and although I didn't mention it in this, one person has offhandedly mentioned that they're growing like fish fins on their neck. And the thing is, yeah, Wendell obviously looks abnormal. He's asymmetrical, both vertically and horizontally. He has some sort of a hunch, and he may even have some sort of a growth. He seems to have like a hunchback and one arm being bigger than the other. Not to mention his unfortunate broken nose. But besides mentioning him having hairy knuckles and hands, nothing about him is monstrous or animalistic. And so I think it's a bit weird that these kids sort of turn into these weird, freaky monsters like that. Like, I was wondering maybe, I mean, it doesn't matter for the story, and so this is not a critique, this is just a personal thing. If I was writing this, I would either have it that people started developing the same abnormalities as Wendell, or, like, he sort of hints at it when he mentions, oh, now you can sort of see what they'd look like inside out. Like, what if the things that they were developing were akin to their own inner beauty, quote unquote, and so that would explain why the bullies look the most hideous, and maybe the reason why Nicole grows scales is because she has a thick skin, question mark? Like, I mean, I don't know how that relates to teeth and bear claws, but you see what I mean? Like, that'd be an interesting way to look at it, and it will sort of lean into the theme. It's not necessary, but like I said, I'm a huge theme guy. I try to base so much of the story off this idea of theme, and I wonder if I can bring it out in more ways than one, and that would be one way that I'd explore it. But that's not really a huge complaint, because I like the way it's done here. It seems to be that instead of it looking at it as one person's beauty and another person's ugliness, there just seems to be some sort of a sliding scale of aesthetic, and when you either gain beauty or lose beauty, it just sort of slides up and down, not based on subjective beauty, based on this idea of a grand overlaid idea of, okay, this does not look pleasing and this does. And look, yeah, I don't think this story is going to change the world. I thought it was very well done, and I think it'd be very good for kids to read a story like this, seeing how if they think of themselves as ugly or think of themselves as fat, like, that doesn't mean you can't be a hero. And I especially like the fact that there's the Mr. Scary and the Wendell character, because there's a big issue in kids' media where if you have a good-looking character, then you might have them become evil, and then it's like, oh, we'll reveal the ugliness underneath. So I think of, like, Ratigan from The Great Mouse Detective. I'm thinking of Cruella de Vil, how when she goes crazy, she starts looking like a wild maniac. And there's an issue here that the good character is also the evil character who's evil. But I like the fact that we learn that Wendell is evil because of the way that he treats other people, because of the way he feels about himself. And instead of the good-looking character turning evil, we see the quote-unquote ugly character looking good and turning into Mr. Scary. And so in a way, it's almost like it's confronting that trope, but shaking things up in such a way that it's not insisting upon this idea that ugly equals evil. In fact, it's insisting on this idea that hatred equals evil. The only thing I don't really understand is the bullies at the end. Why would they be the first person that Nicole goes to? I mean, apparently she's really good at sports. She's great at baseball. Why wouldn't she get someone from the baseball team? I mean, they even say in this story that Jimmy and Eric are on the basketball team. Like, I don't know, maybe it's a sports person thing, I don't know. But it just seems weird to me. And the only reason I can come up with why she went to them first is because of the law of narrative conservation. And I can talk about that a little bit later, but it just seems like because they didn't introduce any other characters, they were the only ones you could really go to. But you know what? Even with that little flaw, that little thing that does niggle and bug me a little bit, I have to say that I adored this story. It was really fun to read. I enjoyed reading through it again, even a second time. I enjoyed it, even knowing the twist with those characters. But more importantly, I think I need to explain, when I am looking at these stories, I'm looking at them on a rubric of how well they achieve what they set out to do. And whilst I don't think this is necessarily going to change the world, I don't think this is the best story I've ever read, I need to say that this story achieves everything it sets out to do, and it does it well. And for that reason, this story, in my eyes, is an A+. Top of the class. Good job, David Bergantino. In my opinion, this was a very good story, and I think there's a lot you can learn from it. There are two things that come to mind, and the first has to be the importance of persistent characterization. I think one of the issues you see in a lot of these Chapter Spooks books, especially Goosebumps, is that the kids act like the plot needs them to, and so they turn on a dime. Suddenly they're jokesters pulling a prank, suddenly they're mean and they're angry at each other, suddenly they're really good friends and they're working together, and it doesn't feel like a real person, it feels like a puppet doing what the author needs them to do for the story. Whereas in this story, even though it's not better plotted than any other story, it's got similar points, it even uses similar tropes like those stories, and yet the characters are consistent. The main character, he always cares about other people, but he always does stand up for himself, even though he does have that deep self-hatred. It's not coming from the way that he values what the bullies and stuff think. It's like there's a point when the bullies, they're picking on him in line, saying, "What are you doing here? We're here because we're cool." And he says, "You two couldn't be cool in a meat locker." Like, he's still the hero and deserves to be, and that's his character. And like Nicole, you can tell the whole way through that she's a tomboy, but she's forcing herself to be this pretty little princess because she knows that might get her famous. And even the mother character, the mother cares about her son. She starts doing this whole thing with parent-teacher, and then when he goes to talk to her, she can't because the plot needs her to not talk to him because he needs to be alone, but they make it work for her character. Like, you can reverse engineer this stuff, and this is the lesson you need to learn. Is that with these stories, it's important to be able to understand these characters. It helps the world feel real. And you might have a moment in the story where you need a character to act strange. You might need a moment where the character needs to do something for the plot to work. But that doesn't mean you need to suddenly make them act out of character, or it might not mean that you've actually characterized them well enough to know what out of character means for them. But the important thing is, if you need them to do something for the plot and you know their character well enough, you can find the right buttons to push to make it work. Like in this story, the right buttons to push to make it that the friends aren't friends at that time is the fact that this girl is trying desperately to be famous. She's putting herself out there, acting like something she's not, and when that fails, she feels ashamed of that, and so she then turns on her friend. Like, that makes perfect sense. It doesn't make sense for best friends to suddenly hate each other, but it makes sense in this moment for this character to hate this other character for this reason. Now, I'm an architect writer, I'm not a gardener. I like to plot everything out, and this means that the plot does drive the character, but that doesn't mean that you need to read it like that. And I've actually had it that characters have influenced the plot, or they've influenced the way that I make my plot happen because I need them to be consistent. That's more important than telling the particular story that I had in mind, because the particular story I had in mind is terrible if nobody believes that these characters are real. If you don't know what your characters are or who they should be, take the time to find out. I honestly, the last story I was writing, I had to stop after a chapter and a half because I realized that it didn't sound good, it didn't work. And the reason why is because I didn't know who the main character was. It took me a week. It took a lot of effort to try to find the personality that fit her and fit the theme of the story I was going for. But once I did, I hit the ground running. I'm up to chapter 4 now because now I know who this character is. So make sure they're consistent. And if you don't know how to do that, stop and decide who they are first before moving on. The second piece, and I know it only really came up at the last second, but it's really been on my mind ever since. I was noticing that and then reading up about some of the tropes and things to do with it. And it is this concept called the law of conservation of narrative detail. Also simply called the law of narrative detail or the law of conservation of detail. The idea is simple. When writing a story, you have a certain number of pages. Obviously, if you like, you could pull a Stephen King and write an absolute brick and have every single thing that you write go into the story. But the thing is that people don't necessarily care about every single side character, and so you don't want to waste someone's time with these things that aren't necessary for the narrative. Hence the name of this law. The law of conservation of narrative detail is that you should conserve your efforts and energies and conserve your word count into propelling the story forward. And that means you shouldn't waste time on extra useless characters. You shouldn't waste time on dealing with subplots that don't actually move your story forward, because people only want to read the story that you're writing, not the stories that are happening in the background that make you feel like your world matters. And this happens not just in writing. In fact, my favorite example is from cartoons. It's not as common these days because of flash animation, but back when people used to use cell animation, you could always tell when something was about to move because it looked brighter on the screen. It had a black outline. And this is because when using cell animation, they would draw the background, they would make it gorgeous, they would put in all the details, but then the thing that was going to move, they'd use simpler details because animation costs a lot and painting a lot costs even more. So it would have simpler detail, but it would look brighter because no matter how much you cut those cells to be really, really thin, they do still change the color of the background a little bit. They tint it slightly, and so the foreground looks brighter. But this is just a facet of animation. If you want to save a bit of money on animation, you animate the bits that matter, and the stuff in the background that's still, like the trees in the ground, you just paint that once and just roll it back and forth as the scene requires. The same is true all over the place. You know, obviously special effects cost money, actors cost money, sets cost money, and so you spend the money and the time on the things that matter for your story. But the reason I'm bringing this up is because in this story, they used two characters that I felt didn't really belong in the scene, two bully characters. And the reason they did that is because they couldn't introduce two new characters at the end of the story. And so here's my bit of advice. Don't be afraid to play with this law. Now, when I say play with it, I'm not saying introduce characters willy-nilly and waste people's time. No. What I'm saying is, for a story like a murder mystery, you know, it's a common joke that people say they can tell who the killer is because it's the most famous actor who has a small bit role, right? Now, that's pretty obvious in those things, but it can also happen in your written story. Sometimes people know who the killer's going to be because they're the background character that you gave the most detail to. Or if you're writing a horror story and suddenly you're spending a lot of time describing the way that the toilet looks, or you're spending a lot of time walking through the woods and describing how scared someone is walking through the woods, you're giving the reader a hint that what's happening here is important to the story, and therefore you need to pay more attention to it because this is what's going to be important to the plot. Like in this story, they had the two characters of Mr. Scary and Wendell. Now, obviously you only need one, and so that can lead the audience to think, hey, maybe they're both evil and both necessary for this story. Now, I obviously missed that twist, but the reason I missed that twist is because I assumed that Wendell was playing the part of the Igor character. I thought that he'd invented this camera for Scary, and so that's why he was hired, and he was secretly evil even though he seemed like he was good, because even though he was trying to help out our main guy Eric because he was, ugly, in reality he was secretly the Igor-like assistant to Scary's Frankenstein. Now, I don't think this necessarily will work on anyone. I think I fell for it because I was so invested in the characters. But this is my point. Because of the law of conservation of narrative detail, if you include someone in your story, then people might be able to pick up on what you're putting down, especially if they are talented readers. Now, obviously, this is YA or middle grade, so they may not recognize these tropes, but for those writers out there going for an older audience, you can trick people into thinking that you're done with a character by pretending there's something else. Introduce a character who is your secret villain by pretending that they are some comic relief character. Slip them in and say, oh, yeah, no, they're doing this, don't worry about it. I believe this is a term referred to as Chekhov's boomerang. You introduce a character, and obviously people know, oh, okay, well, this has to show up in the plot somehow, and then you use them, and then the reader might think, oh, I guess, well, that was just the comic sidekick. Oh, that was just the cranky old man character who exists. Or maybe that was the sheriff who is there only to get the main characters in trouble, when really they have another role to play in the story. But people don't realize that because they assume you'd have to reintroduce a character or introduce someone new in order to have that plot point make sense. You see what I'm saying here? You can use people's knowledge of the mechanics of storytelling in order to sneak a twist into your story, especially for those who are paying really close attention. Like my example, for this story, whilst I think it's perfectly fine using the bully characters, one thing I would have done is, because we're trying to hint at the idea that our main character is ugly, I would have thrown two kids in line with them to make fun of Eric, but then I would have it that Nicole lambasts them for doing so because they're members of a baseball team and she knows them well, and so she might scold them for doing so, call them out by name, and then move on from that scene. So now we've introduced those characters, and then at the end we can redeem them by having them help out. Is that a great idea? Not necessarily. I like the fact that they use the bullies because they're strong enough to stop the gut. But this is my point. You can introduce characters for a twist, but you can hide that twist by hiding them in the machinery of your story. As I've said many times, I don't think that readers should be punished for being smart. So that's why you need to do your research. That's why you need to put in the effort. But for something like this, I don't think you should punish readers who are fervent readers, who are starting to understand the tropes just for knowing the tropes. They should have a good time too, and in some ways, you might even say that they deserve it more. So put in the effort to make sure that they're enjoying your story. At least, that's what I think. But hey, if you thought this was scary, just wait to see what I've got in store for you next time.